and it's also going to make my voice clearer. That being said, thank you for the invite. So the talk I was invited to give in particular was on delivering and impacting arguments. Given this is generally a broad topic, I have assembled a collection of various pieces of advice related to different stages of argument building and argument delivery. How this is broadly going to look is I'm going to discuss prep time and argument generation, and therefore also how to impact those arguments while creating them, i.e. how to come up with good impacts. Secondly, I'm going to discuss what to do in prep time, even if you find yourself in a situation where you don't know much about the motion, or you might be panicking because there's not much info or not much generation going on. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about how to deliver your arguments in a stronger, more argumentatively sound, nuanced way. And lastly, I'm going to talk about delivery in a more rhetorical sense, how to make it more persuasive. I'm also going to try to give some advice as to how to practice all of these things. I will aim for this to last no longer than an hour and a half. In terms of questions, I will leave time for Q&A at the end, but also I will have chat open during this entire time. So if you have questions during the lecture, you can just type them immediately into the chat and I can integrate them into the talk. I think this is probably the best way to do it, because Q&As at the end happen when people already have, attention spans lowered and stuff like this. I think it's probably best if you come up with questions during the lecture, just put them in the chat immediately. I'm going to try to answer them as soon as I see them. That being said, we can start with the talk. So the first thing I want to talk about is prep time, i.e. the different stages of prep time, how to go about it, and what are the important questions that need to be answered during prep time. So the first step that necessarily needs to happen in prep is characterizing the debate. Before going into arguments, before jumping into, okay, I have this idea or this argument headline, the first question is, what is this debate about? And I think this branches into a couple of things. First of all, just a generic question you can always ask yourself is, why do we think the CA team said this motion? What makes them think there's a debate behind this? This is very often related to some kind of either general trend in a particular field, so trends within, let's say, the feminist movement or the LGBTQ movement, or it's related to recent events, for example, a recent international relations intervention or diplomatic congress or something, which has prompted them to set the motion. So the first question is, what is this debate about in real life? And the second question is, how do we imagine a motion to unfold in real life without making arguments? How do we imagine the implementation of a motion to look? A good example of this are narrative debates. So when you have motions like, this house opposes the narrative that glorifies parenthood. Okay, first question, how does this narrative look, right? Where is it present? Is it television, radio? Is it, statements made by famous people? When these statements are made, what do they actually say? How does this idealization look? Are they saying parenthood is the best thing in the world? Are they saying, parenthood creates suffering sometimes, but it's so good, but it's so important and so nice, it's worth it? What is the messaging exactly? Because all of the arguments that you're going to make are going to be based on a particular premise as to how the implementation of emotion is going to unfold in the real world. And therefore, if the premise, i.e. how you imagine the implementation of the motion to look, is incorrect, then the argument in and of itself is not going to have an impact because it's based on a wrong premise. So the first step of prep is to determine, how do you think that the implementation of emotion is going to look? Part of this is also, if it's a this house would motion, coming up with a model. If it's a this house believes that motion, then the question is, how is the implementation of the motion likely to look? What are the incentives of the actors? How do we think this is going to unfold? So the first question is therefore, imagine the battleground. So debating can be conceptualized as a social experiment. You take a human being, or you take a group of human beings, or you take a country, and you conduct a social experiment on them. You take a motion and you do the motion to the people. And then you imagine how they behave under a world which is changed by the motion. And this is the first step of imagination you need to have in order to imagine what is the alternative world in which you're going to make the arguments. Having done that, the second step is to determine clashes and burdens, because it's important to know what you have to prove before moving on to actually proving it. There are a number of ways in which I think you can improve the way in which you determine clashes and burdens, and therefore also the impacts that your arguments are going to deliver. So for me, the first and most important question, and this is also probably the most important question for impacting, insofar as it directly relates to whether you're able to come up with persuasive impacts, is the question of what do you imagine can realistically be changed by virtue of the motion? Because the problem is that debaters very often go for super big world-saving impacts, like we're going to stop this conflict, or we're going to significantly decrease poverty, or we're going to significantly improve the status of minority groups. In most cases, these impacts are not realistic, because in any debate, there are 99.9999 factors outside of the debate that exist on both sides of the house that affect the same issue. A motion is going to target poverty to some extent, or is going to target the resolution of a conflict to some extent. But on both sides of the house, there are still a number of external variables which exist anyway and continue to perpetuate the same problem. So it's incredibly unlikely that you're going to resolve or meaningfully change in a global scale a large amount of huge issues or pressing issues. The question is then, what do you think the motion can realistically do? What is the scope? What is the range of change, of delta, of comparative that you think in real life the motion could produce? And I think the connection to real life is very important here. So for me, the rule of thumb is, do not say anything that you would not shamelessly and in good faith say to your friend over a pint. If what you are saying is something that a buddy that you're drinking a beer with would tell you this is stupid or this is unrealistic, or you have a naive perception of the world, it's not something you want to say in a debate. So the perception you want to have is what you would realistically imagine if discussing this in university or discussing this over a beer. What you can realistically imagine would change if a motion were to be implemented is also what you want to run in a debate. Because teams that win debates are not the teams that have the largest impact, but the teams that have the most persuasive impact. The larger your impact, the larger the burden of proof you need to achieve behind this impact. And particularly in good debates, especially if your impact is huge and not intuitive, good teams are going to very easily shed doubt on this. So you want to focus very clearly on a smaller, more realistic scope of impacts, but one that you can realistically mechanize. And you want to use it to call other teams out. You can explicitly frame this by saying, we know our impacts are smaller in range, but they are the only impacts which can realistically be achieved within this debate. Therefore, the only ones that are going to be proven, therefore the only ones standing at the end of the round. And that's the perception you need to go with. To give two examples here. For example, in the motion that this house believes that the feminist movement should advocate for the abolition of marriage. So things that most propositions and oppositions would run would largely go as follows. Proposition would say, we can have huge societal change because the feminist movement is going to go for this change of narrative. It's going to create a large societal awareness of the problems with marriage. It's going to get a strong, political push, if not for the abolition of marriage, then for the reform of marriage. Opposition is going to say, look, this is going to lead to huge backlash because people are going to perceive that the feminist movement is attacking marriage, is attacking traditional Catholic institutions, and all of these things. And genuinely, I think neither is particularly comparative. I don't think that the feminist movement is able, through criticizing marriage or saying they want to abolish it, get huge amounts of political pressure to reform marital institutions. I think the amount of political capital they have is relatively small here. I think also on opposition, backlash is largely uncomparative because the people who dislike the feminist movement and think that they are, an assault on marriage, think so already. They do not pay attention to nuance in phrasing because the feminist movement already criticizes marriage. They maybe don't say we want to abolish it, but they already criticize. They already say it's a traditional institution, it's imbued with religious ideas which are oppressive to women, and these people already dislike it. Like they're not going to sit down and read feminist theory and underline the words that they're saying. Like this is not going to happen. I think the realistic change within that debate would be to say, look, there's probably a principle insofar as the motion is phrased normatively, i.e. the feminist movement should do something. We can prove that they have an obligation to oppose this, even if they cannot lead to practical change. Secondly, I think there's probably a limited argument to be made in the sense of there's a particular group of young progressive people who are currently being socialized by the feminist movement through social media, through famous individuals who co-opt this. And those are the individuals who we can maybe socialize to have a different viewpoint on marriage, but they're a limited group within society. I think running that case would probably be the strongest case in the round because it's a case that hinges on the realistic premises of what the feminist movement can do or cannot do. Even if it would be good for it to abolish marriage, I don't think any government can prove that they can. So the team in closing government or open government for that matter should first ask themselves the question, okay, what do we think the feminist movement realistically can do? What do we think this narrative is going to achieve? And then build from there. A second example is this house prefers a world where people believe in determinism as opposed to free will. Again, I listened to a debate on this, and most of the clashes here were people saying, okay, but when you have determinism, people find it a lot easier to go through life because they do not have to ponder, the moral implications of their decisions. They do not have to consistently think about whether they are guilty or not. It makes it easier for people to deal with suffering. But then opposition said, oh, but if you don't have free will, then there's less morality, because if people don't take responsibility for their actions, they're not going to create moral systems. I think both of this is not a good argument, because realistically, even if people believe or do not believe in either of these things, most of the time they don't interact with these beliefs. Like everyone in this Zoom call has a belief on determinism versus free will, but you don't think about it 99% of the time. You still go about your lives because you have more proximate desires. You want to have fun, you want to earn money, you want to have food on the table, you want to have friends and love and all of these things. Humans don't interact with metaphysical beliefs all the time. Like even if we have a debate on this, and it's a very heated, good debate, after the round, we're going to go for a beer. We're not going to lie on the floor and look at the ceiling and ponder our lives. This means that most of the arguments on how it influences day-to-day lives and moral systems are not particularly comparative. What is comparative, what I would probably run from government, is to say situations where people do interact with moral systems and actively ponder morality are situations where people are faced with a large amount of stress. So when they're faced with hard decisions, when they're faced with crossroads in their lives, when they're faced with crisis of faith or emotional crises, that's when people defer to metaphysical systems of belief. And in these particular situations, which are the only ones relevant for the round, we think determinism, for example, is going to be useful. I think that this is just an example of how teams will very often run the obvious case. I don't think that the obvious case is necessarily the realistic case, which is why the first question in prep needs to be, what do we think is the realistic scope of change that is going to happen if this motion were to be implemented, or if one side of this motion were to be implemented? This, however, in order for it to be a strong impact in the end, needs to be followed and accompanied by framing. What does this mean? If you are trying to frame something as being uncomparative or unrealistic, for example, the idea feminist movement is not going to abolish marriage, before moving on to your case, you need to explicitly explain what isn't comparative and why it isn't comparative. So this is the first step. If you want to outframe something out of the round, if you want to claim that something is unrealistic, you first have to explain what you think isn't in the debate, and only then move on to what you think is in the debate. And this is something that you're both going to be doing as closing if you're reframing the round, but also as opening. Like even as opening government, you can preemptively outframe things from the round and say, we don't think that impacts regarding this, this, and this, or impacts of this huge size are within the debate for these particular reasons. But you need to give the reasons explicitly. So not just define what is comparative, but also what isn't comparative and why. And you want to take the first mover advantage. So even if you're opening government, you want to do this framing preemptively, because then you are forcing a double burden on the opposition. Because if the opposition wants to run an impact that you have outframed as being outside of the round, in order for them to be able to run this in the first place, they first need to respond to your framing and take down your framing for them to be able to run this at all. So taking the first mover advantage and explicitly outframing things before framing your own case in forces the other side to do a double job in terms of responses. Because for them to run their case in the first place, they first need to take down your framing and show why your framing is not standing in the round, which does double damage and puts a double burden on them. The second question that is very important in terms of getting the good impacts. Once you have framed what the debate is about, so you have determined what is within the range of the comparative and what isn't within the range of the comparative, and you've given reasons for both. Within the range of the comparative, the next question is, where is your case the strongest? Within the boundaries of the debate that you have established, the next step is finding the strongest arguments. And then having found them, you want the debate to primarily revolve around those arguments. Which means, in other words, you want to find the strongest arguments and you want to come up with preemption to whatever obstacles the other side could set for those strongest arguments. To give a couple of examples, if the motion is, this House would not allow media to report on personal details and information about deceased individuals without explicit consent of the family. So the family has to consent for the media to be able to publish information on someone who is deceased. Where is op the strongest? Op is the strongest in claiming the value of this information. We do not want to have the families consent to this because we fear that if we lose this information, we're going to lose valuable info that the public has a right to know, or we're going to lose information that social movements can maybe utilize for their own goals. So then, in order for proposition to win, you want to exclude the strongest op argument from the round. I think a good preemption for this would be to say, we think families are probably going to consent in most cases anyway. Like, there's a number of reasons for this. The first is like they know that they're not going to be able to escape media attention anyway, so they might as well consent. The second is, especially if it's identity motivated, like crisis or crime or event, they probably want to share the story of their loved ones, so that they raise awareness for other people who may be faced with things like race crimes or hate crimes. They also probably want to have this feeling that the entire country is joining them in their grief and the entire country is remembering their loved ones. They probably also want to take control over how their loved ones are presented in the media. They also probably know that if they do not give the media stories, then the media is going to focus on the perpetrator, and this is going to be traumatic. There's a bunch of reasons why families consent anyway, so most of opposition's arguments happen anyway. The comparative is for the very small amount of families who do not consent, and why we think they have a principal right to not consent, and why this helps them deal with their trauma, which I think is both an example of the first thing I talked about, which is, okay, what realistically happens? Do we think that most families will realistically consent? Probably yes. So most of the opposition arguments are probably uncomparative. The second is, okay, where is the proposition case the strongest? The proposition case is strongest in claiming that people have a right to not consent. We want the debate to revolve around that particular argument because it's our strongest argument. So for the debate to revolve around that argument, we need to find a way to exclude other parallel arguments coming from the opposition. And that is how we think about preemptives. Which arguments do we need to exclude for the debate to revolve around what is our strongest content? Another example of this is this house regrets the narrative that romantic love is the primary source of fulfillment in life. Again, thinking about what is the strongest government material. The strongest government material is probably going to be about people who cannot find love, right? Because people who can find love and who are in a relationship are probably happy regardless of whether this narrative exists or not, because they have accessed this already. I mean, if anything, it's probably comparative to the opposite, because like people who are in a relationship and this narrative exists and says this is the primary source of fulfillment, they may be more scared to lose it and enjoy it less. But generally, people who have love are uncomparative. We want, therefore, the debate to revolve around individuals who cannot find romantic love and for whom this narrative is going to make their mental state worse, because they're going to feel not just the deprivation of not being able to access romance, but they're also going to feel that by not accessing romance, they will never actually be happy. In order to do this, we need to exclude opposition arguments that would frame the debate away from this. So we want to explicitly say at the beginning, at the top of the opening government prime minister speech, here is why this debate is mostly or exclusively about individuals who are locked out of romance. This means explicitly providing reasons why it's not about the others. And this is what I said before, providing reasons why something is not comparative. And that's what I said, because if you are in a relationship, you already have love and you've accessed this primary source of fulfillment anyway. So the logic of preemption is to find the opposition arguments that could potentially hurt our frame or divert the frame of the debate away from our arguments and exclude them. And this is how you strengthen your impacts, because your impacts become stronger if you can prove that they are the most relevant ones in the debate, that others are less comparative than the opposition would have you believe, and yours are the most comparative. And this is where an impact is most persuasive, because if you just have parallel impacts that are not weighed against each other, it's incredibly hard to weigh which impact is more important than the other. But if you do weighing of explaining why other impacts are less comparative and yours is more comparative, this is how you create a persuasive impact. And this brings me to the summary of the goal and the role of preemption. So the role of preemption is not to respond to every fathomable op claim, like everything opposition can possibly run. It's also not to respond to what the opposition is probably going to run. It's to respond to what the opposition could run, which would be the most unfavorable to your case. So the best question for preemption is not what will opposition say. The best question for preemption is which potential claims the opposition could make, which would be the most dangerous to our case. So the question for preemption is, which parts of our case we need to protect the most? Where do we think opposition could be strongest? And where do we need to shore up our defenses preemptively? So it's not predicting what the average opposition probably will say, but what the best possible opposition could say that is most harmful to your case. And this is where you target your preemption. And this is how you utilize preemption to build up your impacts. I think a good example of this, or a good analogy for this, I've heard this being used as an analogy for whip speeches, but I think it's just a good analogy for arguments and cases in general. I think you can conceive of cases, or in this case, you can conceive of your impacts through the analogy of obstacles, i.e., imagine that your case or your impact is a nice cottage up the hill, and there is a road leading to this cottage, and you want to get to the cottage. The problem is there are obstacles on the road to the cottage. However, some obstacles are relatively irrelevant. Like if there's a puddle of mud on the road, you can just walk around it. And this is the analogy to all, the opposition makes an irrelevant mitigation that doesn't really harm your case. However, if there is a huge roadblock, or there's barricades on the road, or there's a paramilitary group, roaming the road, this is probably going to be a lot bigger obstacle to your case. So the question is, identify which obstacles could exist to you reaching the final goal, and which of these obstacles are likely to be dangerous. Because you don't need to focus on any obstacle. Some of them can just be sidestepped. Some of them, however, if they remain on the road, if you don't remove them, are going to stop you from reaching the cottage. In other words, some things, if left standing from the opposition, are going to disprove your case. So the question when trying to protect your impacts, or when trying to preemptively defend your impacts, is which things, if proven from the other side, would disprove our case? And this is where you need to focus your preemption. This is how you defend your impacts. So the summary of this, TLDR, is 1, define what the debate is about. 2, think about what is realistic in real life to change by virtue of emotion, and then explain explicitly in the debate why you think this is realistic, and importantly, also explicitly, why other alternative frameworks and impacts are not realistic. And thirdly, focus preemption such that it allows the debate to revolve around your strongest arguments, i.e., identify obstacles to your strongest arguments and remove them preemptively, or at least have the same perception, the same goal when you are doing rebuttal. Of course, this preemption needs to be explicitly flagged in speeches. So say, presuming that the other side says this, or in their strongest variant, their best case scenario, the other side might say this. So this is something that needs to be explicitly flagged within speeches. Now, of course, the question is, this all seemingly presumes that you have good prep, that you are able to generate content in prep, and that you know about the motion. And then I think the obvious question is, sure, but what if we don't know a lot about the motion? What if we cannot generate arguments because we do not have, specific knowledge? I think there's a couple of things that can help you. I think the first piece of advice, although it sounds very generic, is don't panic. Why? Because in most cases, if there's a very specific motion you know nothing about, like if there's, microfinance, chances are that none of the other teams in the debate know about this either. Like maybe you have the bad luck that one of the teams in the round are going to be finance majors. Not all 3 of them are going to be finance majors. And everyone who is not a finance major is just as lost and just as scared as you are. In those situations, teams that win the round, or teams that won, are most able to keep their cool and remain focused on what people are saying and coming up with logical rebuttal as opposed to panicking. And secondly, the teams that are able to make the most out of their prep time, that are at least able to create generic arguments, generic content, and to do this to the largest possible extent. Which means that you cannot afford to lose time on panic. You want other teams to lose time on panic while you are actually doing the legwork to generate at least a generic case. I'm going to give you advice as to how to generate a generic case, but this is something that psychologically needs to be kept in mind. Because also during the debate, if you are panicking, you will not hear what the other side says. And even if they make obvious mistakes, you will not notice them because you're focused on panic. And I think most debates can be debated even if you have no specific knowledge. I'll give you an example. So when we were debating quarterfinals of Euros in 2018, the motion was that the International Monetary Fund should take sovereign control over fiscal policies of countries that are unstable or cannot control their debts or cannot pay back their debts or whatever. And the argument coming from opening government is, the reason why this is good is because wherever the IMF intervenes, the IMF lowers interest rates. Lowering interest rates is good for investment. You don't need to know what any of these words mean to rebut that argument. So I don't need to know what the IMF is. I don't need to know what interest rates are. And I don't need to know what fiscal policy is. The only thing I need to know is this team has suggested that wherever the IMF comes, so in 100 plus diverse scenarios, it always does the same thing. It seems intuitively done that in countries that differ from one another in terms of economy, in terms of geography, in terms of demographics, just basic things, we would always do the same policy. Because if we do the same thing in different scenarios, it seems it's bound to fail in at least half of them. In other words, if I tell a joke, some of you are going to think it's funny, some of you are not, some of you may slap me because it's inappropriate. Because if I tell the same joke to different people, they'll react differently. I don't need to know the meaning of all of these words. I need to know that the base assumption is they have one blanket solution for different scenarios, and this is a bad idea. And I can just focus my rebuttal on saying why we need more diversity in solutions that are better adapted to situation on the ground, to particular economic factors. And I can say countries on the ground know to do this better than the IMF because they have diverse governments and they know situation on the ground. This is good rebuttal to that argument without me even having to go into the depths of understanding what the IMF is or finances. And in most debates, you're going to be able to find and extrapolate such basic assumptions that other teams make. They're hidden behind jargon, they're hidden behind examples, and they're hidden behind statistics, which is why you need to focus and listen to what they're saying in order to detect this. If you're spending time panicking that you don't know specifics about the motion, you will not notice these things, and this is what's going to make you lose, not your lack of knowledge or not your lack of specifics. However, what are the specific types of advice that we can use to generate content when we don't know a lot about the motion? The first thing is you can use word-by-word analysis, which means specific words within the motion have specific implications in terms of the burdens within rounds. First of all, the verb within the motion, grants or bestows different burdens upon teams. So if it's a this house regrets debate, then the team that's regretting needs to propose a counterfactual that cannot just argue about whether X is bad or why X is bad. If the motion is this house prefers a world, they need to compare to the current world and all of these things. If the motion is this house would, they can implement a model. If this house believes that, they cannot implement a model. They have to prove the likelihood that the motion is going to be implemented in a particular way. So the verb within the motion implies specific burdens upon teams. And you can always focus on these burdens and whether or not teams have fulfilled them. Second thing, there are very often quantifiers within motions. So the debate is, this house believes the state should strongly disincentivize women to have children, which was a motion at World. The word strongly implies you need a policy which is going to significantly harm women if they do have children. Because saying we're going to educate them in school about the risks of motherhood is not a strong disincentive, right? A strong disincentive would be to say we're going to cut child support. We're going to remove tax breaks for young parents. We're going to remove paid parental leave. And then you can just argue from opposition why removing these particular things is incredibly harmful and unfair from the state. By analyzing the words within the round and what the words mean for burdens, you can extrapolate what you and the other teams need to argue for or argue against. You can craft cases from this, and this can help you to imagine what the debate is actually going to be about. Okay, so the question is, what should we do when the motion seems somewhat ambiguous and you're faced with two possible interpretations that each give a different debate? So there's two things that you can do. The first is you can debate both of the interpretations, right? You can say this motion can notably mean two things. We think we win regardless of what the motion means. The other is that you can choose a particular interpretation, but you need to explicitly explain why you chose that one and compare to the alternative, because other teams are going to try to raise the alternative against you. So if you're aware of two interpretations and you've chosen one, you need to preemptively give reasons why you've chosen this one and not chosen the other one, including if you're a prime minister from opening government. So those are the two strategic paths you can take. And I think which one you're going to take depends on what the interpretations are. So if one interpretation is more favorable than the other for you, you probably want to find the reason why that's the real one. If you have enough time to win on both, and if you can win on both, it's probably better to do that, because then you've won the debate in two independent scenarios. It's just a strategic question of what you think is more suitable, what you think you have time for. But these are the two ways in which you can go about it. Okay, next thing. If you don't know a lot of specifics about the motion, you can always focus on what you do know. What does this mean? There are always general things that you can infer from the motion. So if the motion is, and this was at Euros 2016, this house believes that Latin American states should significantly support a coup in Venezuela. And you don't know much about Venezuela, or maybe you know nothing about Venezuela. But there are a couple of things you can generally infer. Okay, first of all, the CA team thought it would be a balanced debate to have a coup in a country. This means that a situation within that country probably has to be bad. Otherwise, this would not be a balanced debate. Cool. How does the bad situation look? Okay, where is Venezuela? It's in Latin America. It has a history of coups before. You've learned about this in history class, probably. You know there's like Hugo Chavez, like there's been a dictator. You don't know much, but you can infer generic things about dictatorships, right? So you can say, okay, it's probably has corruption. It probably oppresses people. There's probably, not much media freedom. It's probably bad economic situation. All these things. Okay, what else do we know? There are probably Latin American countries need to be powerful enough for this to work. Otherwise, not a balanced debate. So what are generic reasons that they would be powerful? They have a lot more economic power when they unite. They have more economic power than the Venezuelan government. They're probably going to be supported by the US because the US doesn't like communist regimes. There are all of these generic things you can come up with by just asking yourself basic questions about the debate. Okay, why does the CA team think it would be balanced to have a coup? It has to be a country in problems. Okay, if it's a country in problems, it's a dictatorship. How do dictatorships generally look? And they just apply it to Venezuela. The thing is, you have nothing to lose. So the worst thing that can happen is you're just wrong about Venezuela. And someone knows more than you, and they're going to tell you that you're wrong. And you will take a fourth. But the comparative is that you don't have a case, and again, you take a fourth. So yes, you are risking that you're saying something wrong. You are risking that somebody knows more than you, but there is also a large chance that they won't know more than you, and your generic case is going to go through. Comparatively, if you don't try to come up with a characterization, even if it may be wrong, and if you're just like, I don't know much about this, so I'm not going to say anything, you're definitely going to be fourth. So the risk of trying to assume general things pays off. Another example, there was a motion at Euros 2017 about whether feminist movement in India should utilize aggressive female goddesses in their advocacy. So there are a couple of goddesses. There was an info slide. There are a couple of goddesses in the Indian pantheon that are female and that are actively hostile towards male. So they are depicted as sitting on male bodies or things like this. I think most people don't have a particular grasp of knowledge on the Indian feminist movement, but there are some things you can infer. Okay, so we know in general that India is a relatively conservative country. So if you've learned about India in high school, you've heard of the caste system, there's a rigid religious system. So already you can make the generic argument of, in a conservative religious country, it probably pays off to use religion to convince religious people to be less conservative. Second thing, we know from the info slide, India is polytheist. What are the general benefits of polytheism for social movements? You can tailor your advocacy to particular regions. So if there's a particular region that worships a particular goddess, you can use that goddess. You can use their traditional myths. You can use different advocacies in different regions and all of these things. And it's again not tied to knowing about Indian polytheism in particular, but just polytheism in general and what kind of benefit it could bring to the advocacy of the movement. And again, the risk is, there may be someone from India in the room and they're going to tell you that you're wrong. Sure. But if there's not someone from India in the room and you can make a persuasive enough characterization, you can win that debate. And also, in most situations, you will actually not be lying. Because in most situations, you can actually infer basic characterizations of groups and countries from general knowledge without them being untrue. You will lack specifics, but you're still going to be generally correct. So the risk is not that big, it can pay off. Another thing you can do if you don't know a lot about the motion is or in a particular situation where let's say you're opening government and you think opposition is super strong, like you can see an opposition case, you would have an opposition case in the blink of an eye, you don't know what government case is. You can start building the government case from preemptives. So you can start by thinking about what are the things you would say from opposition and then try responding to them. Because if you don't have a government case, but you have an opposition case, you can try to rebut the opposition case that you have and then fashion the government case from that rebuttal. So there are a number of ways in which you can act that can reduce the problematic situation of not knowing about the debate. The last thing I want to share here And this is going to take like 15 minutes for me to explain, but I think it's very important in terms of you being able to generate actually persuasive impacts. Because remember that I said that in order to generate impacts, you need to have strong, nuanced mechanization behind these impacts. I'm going to give you a couple of templates that would help you do this. I see a person is raising their hand. So if you have a question, you can either say it out loud or type it in the chat, whatever suits you. I think this is...
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you now?
Sorry?
To make my question. Can I make my question now, or would you rather that I wait for the end?
You can do it now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so what happens when the first person made a really good argument and you're just coming right after? Because sometimes I freak out thinking that I might not be good as them. And when I see that someone is doing a very good job standing for their points, I feel like I might not be good enough to be them. And when they just did what you already told us, which is they introduced the subject, and then right after they said what I wanted to say, you know, they just said what I wanted to say and answered it. How would you feel, and how would you try to make a change, or, you know, to call attention, or just to be better? Because sometimes I actually get very nervous about... I've been in a debate club for 2 months, so I'm still a little bit nervous and anxious about it. But how do you do when you see your competitors are very, very good?
Okay, so a lot of this is going to be answered towards the end in terms of at least practical things, in terms of how you can, you know, work to improve. But I think in terms of psychological aspect, there's a couple of things to say here. I think, first of all, no one can deliver a perfect speech in 7 minutes. So because you are restricted to 7 minutes, everyone, even if they are the best debaters in the world, are going to underanalyze something. They're going to miss some mechanisms. They're going to miss some logical links. Nobody can deliver a perfect speech. So what you should focus on is trying to locate mistakes. So when people hear somebody doing very well, they start focusing on them doing very well. And oh my God, they have this mechanism and this mechanism. But the mindset should be, okay, what do they not have? You actively want to look for missing links. This also relates to how people take notes. I think that very often when people get very nervous about speakers before them, they tend to write too much. They tend to write down every word that they're saying because they're saying so many mechanisms, so many examples. This is not the right way to go. Of course, you need to write their speech and write notes in such a way that you know what they said, but the focus needs to be on listening closely to what they're saying and listening to what the assumptions of their arguments are. And this is the example I gave with the IMF. The team that made this argument ended up being in the finals of Euros that year. We went through with them in that quarterfinal. So they're a very good team. They won incredibly important tournaments. And they made a complex argument. But the assumption behind that argument was simple and refutable. However, in order for us to notice that assumption, we needed to remind ourselves that they're not going to run a perfect case because they only have 7 minutes. And we needed to focus more on listening and less on writing. The second thing, in terms of people being, you know, amazing speakers and having more experience than you. The thing to remember is when they are debating against you, they have more to lose than you do. Because know that most debaters have self-confidence issues. And like the best debaters in the world, they look incredibly confident. They look so cocky and, you know, they think they're going to win. Most debaters don't think that. And from talking to a lot of debaters who've been in the finals of Worlds and Euros, most of them have self-confidence issues. Most of them have self-doubt. Most of them are afraid going into a debate that they're going to flunk it, that they're going to, you know, fuck it up. It's going to go bad for them. The thing is, when you are the underdog debating against them, you have nothing to lose. Like if you lose to Oxford A, nobody's going to say, oh my God, you lost to Oxford A. How could you lose to Oxford A? If you beat Oxford, they're going to be legends. Like new ESL team in the block, they beat Oxford A. For Oxford A, the calculus is different because if they win against you, it's a routine win. Everyone expected them to win. No excitement here. But if they lose to you, Oh, they're going to have to justify to themselves how they lost to a novice team and they want to win Euros, they want to win Worlds, but they lost to a team that nobody knows. And they're going to be scared if this harms their reputation or if they're going to do badly in the next round. So they're probably more afraid of losing to you than you are of losing to them, because you have no reason to be afraid of losing to them. And then it just comes down to a battle of wits, right? So it comes down to, they may have more specific knowledge than you, right? Sure. But they're not smarter, which means that they're going to make mistakes. And you can notice these mistakes as long as you have, the correct psychological mindset. But even in the worst case scenario, where you do not have a direct rebuttal to what they're saying, so they're saying very good arguments, you do not have direct responses, you can always weigh against your case. So you can say, okay, even if they prove this perfectly, and even if we grant them this argument, our case is more important than that. Because even if they have some impact on their side of the house and they prove this well, our impact is bigger, or our impact is more intense, or our impact helps more vulnerable people, or whichever metric you want to use. It's for a weighing workshop, not for an impacting workshop, so no time to go into this here. But you can say our case outweighs theirs in importance, even if theirs was proven. And I think this is a good maneuver to generally have. So when generally you are rebutting somebody's case, the first step is to say, we think that they are wrong, or we have mitigation to their case, so we're going to flip their case. But the second step is to say, even if we say that they are correct, or they're somewhat correct, our case is just more important, and you should prioritize our impact over theirs, even if their impact were proven. At the end of the talk, I'm going to also talk about, strategies to improve, strategies to train. So I'm going to get to that as well. But for now, this is the advice, at least in terms of what you can do in debate, and in terms of how you can, deal with the psychological aspect. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, another question is in the chat. I found it very hard to draw the line between characterization, impacting, mechanization, and when I should stop. Drawing the line between incentives and mechanisms or impacting, and knowing when I should go further so I don't get framed out or undervalued, or when I should just move to the next point. What is the structure that you use for speeches or arguments? So I don't have a specific structure. I don't have a template. What I usually do is I say, we think this is going to happen, and that's a statement of the impact. Then I say, these are the reasons why I think it's going to happen, and those are the mechanisms. And then I say, here's why it's important in the round, and that's the weighing. I've proven this impact, but why should the judge care about this impact in the end? So that's like the general idea I have. Okay, I have a statement, I have reasons why the statement is true, and then when the statement is proven to be true, why the statement is important. In terms of knowing when to stop, I think this is something that comes with experience. I think, however, the most important thing to do is ensure that your most important mechanisms are set. So you want your best mechanisms to be at the top. So even if you have time management issues, if you have to cut something on the go to get to your second argument, you want to ensure that the things that you cut are the things that are less important. So you want to ensure that your strongest mechanisms are going to be set at the end of the day. I'm going to talk more about this a little bit later, but I think largely drawing the line of how much you need to mechanize and how much you need to impact differs from motion to motion, from debate to debate. And getting to understand that doesn't have a template. It's more of a question of doing a large amount of debates and realizing this instinctively. I think also judging can help, right? Because if you judge, you get a different perspective. You get the perspective of, okay, what do judges evaluate in terms of how much impacting is enough impacting, or how much mechanizing is enough mechanizing. And then you can use this knowledge when you're debating as well. I think this is largely experience. So I hope that this answers the question. Okay, so moving back to what I was talking about, I'm going to give you two templates that you can use to make your impacts more persuasive. Specifically, I'm going to talk about power analysis and incentive analysis. What does this mean in short? This means that every actor in a debate has particular incentives and motivations. There are things they want to do and things they want to achieve. Incentives that actors have are the primary predictors of their behavior, because actors are going to behave in a way that is more or less tied to what they want or what they desire. Therefore, proving that an actor has a particular incentive and that this incentive is going to be utilized in a good way by the motion or targeted by the motion is a prerequisite to an argument about an actor behaving in a particular way being a persuasive argument. The second thing here is to note that actors may want something, they may not be able to get something. So they have incentives, but they also have varying degrees of power to actually achieve and fulfill their incentives. And these levels of power are also predictors of their actions, not just the level of power that they have, but also the awareness that they have of the level of power they possess. So I'm going to give you a template of 3 points for incentive analysis and 3 points for power analysis, which is going to allow you to strongly characterize actors and therefore create persuasive mechanisms as to why your impacts are going to happen. In incentive analysis, we have 3 questions. The first question, very obviously, is what does the actor want? And there are different things that they may want. And similar to what I said earlier, even if you don't know a lot about the motion, you can always infer general things. So every country wants to be independent, they want to be safe, they want to have money. Every person wants to be happy, they want to be alive and not dead, they want to find love and friendship. Every company wants to get profit, wants to avoid lawsuits. So even if it's a very specific actor, this actor is still part of a larger, broader group of actors. It's a human, or a group of people, or a country, or a company, and you can always infer the things that they may want. You also want to explain why they want it. So what are the characteristics of the actor that make them want it? There have to be reasons why a particular actor X wants a particular thing Y. So the sub-question here is, why does the actor want what you're claiming the actor wants? Because you need to give reasons as to why you think people are going to behave in a particular way. The second question, and this is where it gets more important, is how far are they willing to go to get it? Because the thing is, actors have different incentives. And these incentives are arranged in a hierarchy. We can want different things, and we want some things more than we want others. This means that we are prepared to sacrifice some things for others. And as a corollary, we are not prepared to sacrifice some things for others. So some things are lower priority, and we're willing to let them go for higher priorities. Some things are a red line. Beyond this, we will not go. Something we will never sacrifice, something we're never willing to do. To give a hypothetical example, and this is of course never going to happen. It's a stupid example, but just to illustrate what I mean. So if you are, let's say, a member, if you're talking about a member of this privileged minority who is being oppressed by the state and the majority society, and one day there's a prophet or some kind of magician, and he comes to you and he says, look, I have the power to stop discrimination against your group immediately. Like from tomorrow, you're going to be treated just like everyone else. But for this, I need you to sacrifice your entire family. Depending on who you are as a person, a lot of people would say, no way, because I have an incentive to not be discriminated, but my love towards my family is a red line I'm not going to cross. I'm not going to sacrifice them. Some people who have less connection to their family might say, yeah, sure, like that's a fair sacrifice. I care about them, I care about myself more. But in both of these situations, you have people having 2 very strong incentives, but one being more powerful than the other. A real life example is to say, and I think this is probably very relevant if you look at the situation of Afghanistan or the Taliban and all of this. If you have religious extremists, these are individuals who are even prepared to sacrifice their lives for the cause, like suicide bombers and all these things. Rationally, sacrificing your life is a very dumb thing to do. But for them, the priority of achieving the metaphysical good, which is the rule of God on earth, or however they perceive it as religious extremists, is something they prioritize. This is also a reason why very often there is no negotiation with terrorist groups, because they do not necessarily strive for material gain if they're religious groups. They strive for metaphysical things. But the thing is, in order to strongly and persuasively characterize an actor's incentives, you also want to keep in mind the hierarchy of incentives that they have, to explain what are they willing to do and what are they not willing to do, what line they're willing to cross, what are they not willing to cross. So for example, in a debate about Israel and Palestine, and let's say a 2-state solution in Israel and Palestine, an argument you can make against 2-state solution is to say, both of these sides regard the same land to be holy. If it's holy, it was given to them by God. Therefore, it's not a piece of land to be traded. It is a gift of God, which if traded is literally sacrilege and giving the land of God to the sworn enemy, and they are not willing to do this because this is the red line for them. Even if a 2-state solution would be materially better, they do not want to cross the metaphysical line. And this is, for example, a good rebuttal to a team claiming, but yeah, 2-state solution would be very rational. Maybe, but the way the actors perceive this is a different way. So this is why it's important to have in mind the hierarchy of incentives. And the last question is, what irrationalities is the actor influenced by? And this is also my problem with rational choice theory, because people are not rational maximizers of utility. Like there are things which could objectively be more utile for people. Not all people do the best things for themselves. Why? Because they're under the influence of subjective perceptions and emotions. People can be angry, people can be afraid, people can be deeply convinced of certain beliefs or ideologies, people can be in love, people can hate each other. All of these things make people behave in different ways. And I think an example I already gave is conducive here as well. It is most irrational in terms of utility to die, because if you're dead, you cannot experience any utility anymore. But people are very often willing to sacrifice themselves for things, for beliefs, for ideologies, for their loved ones. All of this happens because they do not just rationally consider consequences, they also consider, or subconsciously this happens, like their emotions and things like this. So you need to keep in mind, not necessarily what is going to be objectively the best for the actor, but how is the actor likely to act based on their complete state of mind or their system of beliefs. And this is also incredibly important when debating actor emotions, because teams are very often going to make impacts based on, oh, this is the best possible impact for the actor. Sure, but we are still debating from the perspective of the actor. If the actor doesn't perceive this to be the best possible impact for them, then that's irrelevant from the perspective of an actor emotion and is therefore not a strong impact within that particular round. So these are the ways in which you can answer questions about what actors want and to what extent they want it. And these are the prerequisites for having a strong impact, because they make the impact persuasive. Because you can convince the judge that actors are going to act in a particular way and therefore produce your impact. This is where the impact gets proven within the debate. The second step, however, is to prove that the actors are actually able to achieve their interests. In other words, they have the power or the capacity necessary to achieve their interests. I'm therefore going to give you a template of 3 different types of power that actors can have, and that you can use to identify what power actors have and what extent of power they have. I extrapolated this from a concept known as the 3 phases of power, which is a concept in political sociology, which I adapted to using in debate analysis. So in terms of types of power that people can have, the first one and most basic, most obvious one is coercive power. Coercive power, in short, is the ability of actor A to force actor B to do something even though actor B would not do that of their own volition. This, therefore, implies sanction. The reason why actor B will do something, even though they would not otherwise want it, is because there are negative consequences if actor B doesn't do that. A good example of this, and the most obvious, is the state. And the state has coercive power to force us to do its bidding, because if we don't, the state has the law, the courts, and the police. It can use this to prosecute us and to put us in jail. In worst cases, the state can use the military against us as a form of force which we cannot resist. So the reason why we abide the state is not because we would want to, but because we are forced to. The second thing to keep in mind here is that fear of sanction is very often motivation enough for people to act in a particular way. So the reason why we follow the law is because we know that if we do not follow the law, sanctions will ensue. So we are acting out of fear of sanction, not out of the sanction being imposed in and of itself. So coercion very often doesn't have to be exercised for you to do something. You just need to know there is a threat of something happening. Terrorism is a good example of this. So a terrorist group, let's say the IRA, can say, we're going to blow up a car in the center of Derry if you do not give us these concessions. They don't need to blow up the car. They just need to frighten the government into thinking that they'll blow up the car. And this is going to have, huge repercussions. People are going to die, and the government is going to give in to them. Notably, coercive power exists on a far lower level as well. So I would say a school bully has coercive power over you, because they can force you to give them your lunchbox, because if you don't, they're going to wedgie you or stuff you in a locker, or put your head in the toilet or something horrible like this. And they can also scare you into saying, I will put your head in the toilet if you don't give me your lunch, so you better do this. Of course, the school bully has a far lower amount of power than the state. So all of these types of power can exist to different extents. But the type of power is the idea of being able to sanction someone or to scare someone with sanction doing something that you want. So the question is it Max Weber? So Max Weber's definition of the state uses coercive power. So Max Weber defines the state as an institution or a collection of institutions that holds a legitimate monopoly on coercive power. However, the definition of coercive power itself was not given by Max Weber. I cannot remember the guy who defined it. Max Weber uses, however, this term of coercive power to define the state. So to that extent, it is Max Weber. The second type of power that can be exercised is agenda setting power. Agenda setting power, trivially, is the ability to determine what is going to be talked about and what is not going to be talked about, i.e., the ability to push a issue, a discussion to the forefront of discourse, or to shut down discussion or awareness about an issue. In the most literal sense, agenda setting, an example of agenda setting power is the ruling party in parliament that controls the docket. So the ruling party largely controls the day-to-day agenda of the parliament and what is going to be discussed. And therefore, they can shut down opposition proposals, even if the opposition wants to have a discussion on something important, or they want to have, propose a bill that is going to deal with some kind of issue. They don't have enough votes to do this. They don't have control over the docket because they don't preside over the parliament. So the ruling party can, shut down issues or push issues based on what they want to do. But I think on a broader scale, a very good example of this would be famous individuals and their ability to reach out to people. So let's say I want to save stray animals in Croatia, and I go to the main square in Zagreb, and I climb the main statue and I start yelling, "Save the cat, save the dogs, like we need to save the stray animals." Nobody's going to listen to me. So people are going to say I'm crazy, and the police is going to come and they're going to take me away, and people are just going to say, "Oh, look, crazy guy who shouted about cats in the main square of Zagreb." If, however, let's say Beyonce comes to Zagreb, to the main square, and talks about how we need to save stray cats in Croatia, not only is everyone going to turn around and listen because it's fucking Beyonce, but it's also like the media is going to report on this. Like everyone in the world, like Guardian, BBC, is going to write articles about how Beyonce is campaigning for the rights of stray animals in Croatia. And people who would not have otherwise heard about stray animals in Croatia will now know about stray animals in Croatia. But also because some people are fans of Beyonce and they want to support the issues that she supports, they're actually going to look into donating. They're going to look up links, they're going to look up shelters, they're going to give money because somebody who they have an emotional connection to has urged them to do this. So by using her global popularity, her access to the media, her access to fans, Beyonce can legitimately make stray cats in Croatia a global issue, an issue that people know about. The same is when Argentina boycotted a friendly football match with Israel over the issue of Palestine. Lionel Messi has billions of fans worldwide. When Lionel Messi says, as Argentina captain, we will boycott because of the issues with Palestine, then people who are Lionel Messi fans will actually be interested in this because this is my idol, my captain. Why is my captain boycotting? I want to know what the issue in Palestine is. When Lionel Messi brings it up, due to the influence he has, he can make this a global issue and he can make people aware of this or even act upon this that would not have otherwise done it. And the same is true for shutting things down. So let's say, for example, I think religion is a good example of this. So in the Catholic Church, you have the Pope. So Pope Francis can say, look, as the church, we need to have a discussion about how we treat atheists, about how we treat sexual and gender minorities, because they are all children of God and we should give them our respect and they have the right to access heaven. Pope Francis can also say, as the Pope, as the legitimate representative of God on earth, I'm going to shut down this discussion because I believe it's a sinful discussion. The Pope has agenda setting power because he is the proverbial 13th apostle. He is the successor to St. Peter. He's the closest to God on earth. So the Pope has the ability to reach out to Christians and say, with the authority of the Pope, I implore you to consider changing your perspective. But he can also say, with the authority of the Pope, I declare that certain aspects of thought are sinful. And his authority as the Pope grants him agenda setting power to make this a matter of discussion or to shut it down as a matter of discussion. So this is a level of power which goes beyond coercion. It affects whether something is discussed or not discussed in the first place. And then the third level of power, the most insidious one, is preference shaping power. Preference shaping power, trivially, is the ability to convince an actor that they genuinely want something, and to make them do something, not out of a fear of sanction, but out of a genuine belief that they desire this. And the best example here, I think, is advertisement, right? So the goal of every good beer advertisement, for like Heineken, is for you to see, oh my God, this looks so fresh, this looks so cold, this looks so tasty, I want a beer now. If after seeing the advertisement, your thought is, I want a beer now, the advertisement has exercised preference shaping power over you, because it has made you desire a beer through its influence on you. I think this is particularly true in today's world and the world of social media algorithms and advertisement on the internet, where they collect metadata on you. They know patterns of how much time you spend on content, where you have clicked, where you haven't clicked, things that you don't know about yourself or don't consciously know. And they're able to target advertisement to you in such a way that they make you want things that you're not even aware of. But I think people who have this kind of power also overlap with agenda setting power, right? Because I think the same is true for the Pope, right? Because the Pope, given he is the prime representative of God on earth, and he is a religious leader and a guide, he can say, I think that for the salvation of your souls, you should pursue this type of action. And given that people trust the Pope and they also want their souls to be saved, they will genuinely want to follow the words of the Pope. He doesn't have to sanction them. He just has to say, this is good for you. And given he has the authority to do that, people's preferences are legitimately going to be shaped by this. So in short, it's the ability to convince people that something is good for them. And if you do this successfully, they're going to execute this action regardless of any future action you take. This is also the most efficient type of power, because it doesn't require constant supervision. It doesn't require the exercise of coercion or the spending of resources. If exercised successfully, people continue to do things you want them to do, even without you enforcing this. So these are the 3 types of power you can use in debates in prep time to analyze. What you need to keep in mind is, as I've already said, first of all, there are different levels to which actors have this power. So 2 actors can have the same type of power, but have it to different levels. But also actors can have different types of power simultaneously. So the state has all 3 types of power, right? The state has coercive power, the state has agenda setting power, and it has preference shaping power. Some actors will have 2 out of the 3. Some actors will have 1, some will have 0, but it's possible to have different types of power simultaneously, something to keep in mind. This concludes the first and longer part about how to prep a debate, how to come up with a good argument, how to make the impact strong, and what templates or advice to use. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to move on to general advice, which for delivery persuasiveness and for delivery strength. I've divided this into 3 parts. And the first is how to deliver an argument for it to be stronger. The second one is how to deliver an argument in order for it to be more persuasive. The third one is how to practice to get better at this. In terms of general advice for strong delivery in terms of analytical strength, analytical rigor. The first thing is, if you are new to debating, you may want to have an argument template. This is not something that you're going to use universally. This is not something you're going to use forever. But when building arguments, it could make sense to write them down in a structured form that has different parts which are visible on your paper or on your Excel sheet. So you can make a table in your Excel sheet, or you can draw lines on your paper to delineate. And this, you might have heard this. This is called the sexy structure. Why is it called the sexy structure? So I'm going to write this down in the chat. That's the easiest. It's called the sexy structure because S stands for statement, E stands for explanation, X stands for example, I stands for importance. Which means that for every argument or for every impact, there is, first of all, a statement. This is going to happen. Then the explanation. Here is why we think it's going to happen. Here is the mechanisms for this. Here is the characterization behind this. Then the example, which doesn't have to be a real life example or statistics. It can be an analogy, it can be a made up example. For example, let's say that in my life I encountered this situation. It serves to illustrate that your mechanisms are actually realistic. You give a mechanism and you say, look, this example shows it's actually realistic, it happens in real life. And I is importance in the sense of, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, why is the argument important for the round? If you prove this argument, why should the judge care? I think it's useful to have this kind of template if you're new to debating, in order to have your arguments clearly structured for yourself when you deliver them, but also to make flagging easier. Because for judges to be able to track your arguments, you need to clearly flag what part of your argument you're explaining. So if you have this divided into the sexy structure, you can use this for flagging, i.e. you can flag when you are moving from one letter to the other. Okay, so what we claim is going to happen in this argument, and you give the statement. Here are the reasons why we think this is going to happen. Let's move on to the explanation. Here's an example which proves this is realistic. That's the example. And here is why we think it matters. If you have it clearly visually delineated, it also helps you clearly flag transitions within the argument in terms of what part of the argument you're proving, therefore making the argument easier for the judge to track. The second important thing, and I want to emphasize the I part, the final part of the sexy structure, is what does the argument do to the round? Because you can prove an argument. It doesn't mean the argument is important. It doesn't mean it's the most important in the round. So notably, if there's a debate about, I don't know, post-conflict reconciliation or ethnic cleansing, and somebody uses an example of World War II, and they say World War II ended in 1947, and you stand up and you say, no, World War II ended in 1945. Notably, you've won that clash. You have won the clash of historical accuracy. It's probably going to be incredibly irrelevant as to who wins the round, because their example and what they want to illustrate and their mechanisms are probably still true, regardless of what year World War II ended in. So proving something is not enough. You need to prove why it matters. You've proven something. So you want to explicitly say how you proving an impact changes the balance of the round. So, for example, by proving this impact, we show that on the metric of whatever in this debate, we have achieved the largest change on this mutual metric. Or this argument directly disproves the claim from the other side, because they claim this, but our argument through its mechanism shows that the opposite is going to happen. It's also an example of using your content as rebuttal. Or given that we've proven this argument, given it's the largest impact in the round, even if other teams have proven their impacts as well, ours is still more important. These conclusions are going to vary. The thing is, you want to tell the judge how you proving the argument tilts the balance of power in the round. In other words, how is it going to impact the final adjudication? Us proving this argument means X, Y, Z for us winning the round. And this is the template way in which you frame the importance part. Why does us proving this matter for us winning? How does it help us win? And how does it shift the balance in the debate? The last thing, and this is tied to the importance part, you want to end all larger pieces of content with weighing. Not just weighing against your bench if you're closing, but also against the other teams. What does this mean? In good debates, everyone is going to prove something. So if in your room have Oxford, Cambridge, and LSE, all of them are going to prove their arguments. How you win a good debate is not by showing that the other side is wrong, it's by mitigating them as much as you can, and then showing that you are more important. So between four well-proven cases, our case weighs as the most important, which means that you need to establish metrics for your impacts. i.e., metrics are reasons why your impact is more important than another impact. And there can be different metrics. And this is a question for a different session. There can be a metric of does the impact, which impact influences more people, which impact influences the most vulnerable people, which impact is more principally legitimate. Doesn't matter. But there needs to be a way for you to explain why this impact is better than another impact, which is going to be posited by another team in the round. Of course, you want to rebut their impacts. Of course, you want to mitigate their impacts. But in most cases, you're not going to be able to do this 100%. So you're going to be able to weaken the other side, not take them down completely. So you need to be able to have a metric that shows why you win over the weakened version of their case or the weakened version of their argument. What does this mean? This means that it's incredibly important to keep in mind that you need to end larger pieces of content with explicit weighing. This argument is more important than the other ones raised in the debate, even if they are proven because of this particular metric. The second thing to keep in mind is that metrics need to be weighed against each other, because teams are going to use different metrics to prove that their impacts are important. You are going to say, we help the most vulnerable group in the round. an opposition is going to say, yeah, but we help a larger amount of people in the round. How do we know, as a judge, which metric is more important? So if there are different metrics, there is also the second meta level of a metric versus metric. So then as the government, you want to say, sure, you help more people, but given that these people are comparatively more privileged, there is not a large comparative. We help the most vulnerable group and therefore have the bigger comparative, which is why our metric is more important. So when building impacts, the first thing is already in prep, you want to already include, choose a metric which suits you, include a metric, how you're going to measure this impact. The second is, you need to come up with reasons why this metric specifically is the most important metric, because you're going to have to weigh against other metrics in the debate, because metrics are what makes impact important or unimportant. Otherwise, an impact is just an impact. What makes it more or less important than other impacts is the metric used to weigh it with. This is important to keep in mind. Lastly, just in terms of how you can generate content better as a team. But before that, the question is it more strategic to make effort spending a lot of time on rebuttal or premise or weighing impacts? So I think if this question refers to prep time, it really depends from motion to motion. Like, so if you have a motion where you're a government and you think it's up-weighted, you probably want to spend a lot on thinking of how you can respond to the strongest up case. If you think the motion is very narrow and you think it's probably about just one argument, you want to spend a lot of time excluding the other arguments, because to narrow the debate down, you have proof why you're narrowing it down. If there is a very broad motion with a lot of arguments and you're OG or OO, you probably want to spend the most time in prep just generating content and running the largest amount of arguments and burning closing. Like, this is something just going to be a strategic consideration based on the debate, so the motion at hand, based on the position you have, based on the teams in the room, because if you know the teams in the room, you also can know their strengths and weaknesses, and based on your own decision on how you want to win the debate. So I don't think this is something that has a template answer, and I think it would be harmful to try to find a template answer to this. It's a question of what suits the particular situation you find yourself in. Lastly, just in terms of generating good content as a team, the first thing is, as a deputy speaker and as an extension speaker, there is a particular mindset I think is very useful for you to be able to generate strong, impactful additions to debates. Deputies towards their first speakers, as well as extensions towards their top half, should assume a critical adjudication position. What does this mean? If you are a deputy speaker listening to your prime minister or to your LO, who are your partner, you want to focus on finding the things they did wrong, not listen to the things they did well. Why? As a deputy speaker, you need to expand on what they said. If you just repeat their speech, you're not going to be able to rebut the opposition well, and you're not going to expand your case. So the way you want to look at this, you want to look at it as if you were an adjudicator judging them. So if you were judging this speaker and you would have to give them feedback, what feedback would you give? What could they have done better? What could they have had more examples for? Is there an argument they could have run? What rebuttal were they vulnerable to, and how would you have resolved that vulnerability? Same goes for extensions, because like extension speakers, very often the way they perceive extensions is, I have a list of 5 argument headlines, and then they just, when opening government or opening opposition mentions this headline, they just cross it out. But this is not how extensions work. The point of the extension is not to bring a new argument. The point of the extension is to bring the most persuasive contribution as to why a particular side wins. And the way in which you do this, particularly in good rounds, is most often analysis extension, which is, there is a case brought by the opening government. You want to find what's lacking in the case. Where are the missing mechanistic links? Where are the missing characterizations? Where are the missing impacts? And you want to insert yourself within that. So the logic is not, do I have a completely new argument? The logic is, if I'm listening to my top half as if I were judging them, where would I give them feedback? What could they improve on? And then these areas where they can improve, this is also where you fit your extension, or where you fit your expansion of the case as a deputy speaker. So always assume a critical adjudication position when listening to speakers on your bench before you, because when you notice mistakes, this is also the guideline as to where you want to focus most of your analysis after that. The last thing that's important to keep in mind here is just good communication with your partner, because delegation of duties is incredibly important for a team to be able to deliver strong impacts over the course of an entire debate. What does this mean? This means that if you are a whip and you need to refute the closing government impacts, but you also need to refute opening government. And you don't have time to deal with OG because you're listening to CG. You can tell your partner, please write me down rebuttals to opening government because I don't have time to deal with this. Also, you can ask your partner whether they need something. So when your partner is listening to a speech, you need to rebut. You can ask them, what do you need? New mechanisms? Do you need new responses? And I can help you with this. You can use your partner to listen. So if you want your extension to be the most impactful in the round, but as a member of government, you're also writing your extension during DPM already because you need to have time to write your extension. You can tell your partner, please listen to the DPM and tell me if they say something relevant which steals our impacts. So communicating with your partner, delegating duties, telling them to help you with something, and being open to them asking you the same thing is an incredibly important prerequisite for you being actually able to perform well in debates and generate good impacts. Second part, in terms of persuasive delivery and how to make your argument just stick better. I think there are a couple of things you can use here. The first is, I think the way in which people frame and phrase their first minute is incredibly important. I think a lot of ESL speakers waste their first minute on useless stuff. So it's either a stylistic introduction that doesn't make sense in the debate, or it's long flagging. I'm first going to give my first argument, which says this, and then I'm going to give my second argument, which says this. This is a waste of time, particularly because native speakers can always speak faster than you, right? They don't have to translate while they speak, which means that they're always going to have a larger rate of words per second. This means you need to make up for the time lost. How do you make up for the time lost? You want every word you say to be a word that the judge is going to write it down. Flagging or stylistic introductions are therefore useless. Nobody has ever lost a PP debate because they did not flag their arguments at the top. If you want to flag, you can do this in 5 seconds, but first on this, second on this, third on this, or you can flag on the go. I'm now going to my first argument. I now finished my first argument, and so on and so forth. What you want to do with your first minute, you want to use introductory sentences that allow you to jump into content immediately. So you want to say things like, the primary mistake of the opposition side is, and then immediately move into rebuttal. Or, before explaining what is comparative in the round, I'll explain what isn't comparative and immediately move to the framing. Or, dear panel, no time for fancy intros, a lot of things to say. First, and immediately move into content. All of these still sound stylistically persuasive, but they allow you to literally start spewing content from the 4th or 5th second instead of the 45th. Which grants you 40 more seconds to flesh out your impacts and to flesh out your mechanisms, which I think is very important in terms of leveling the playing field against native speakers. Okay, there is a question in the chat. When forced to enter deeper levels of meta debate, I generally have a difficult time finding explanations for things we usually take for granted as universal truth or find obvious on a day-to-day basis, e.g., why freedom is so important or why quantity in some cases feels more relevant than vulnerability. Do you have any tips on that? Well, this is again an argument-to-argument question, because depending on the value you're arguing for, depending on the metric you're using, there's going to be very specific analysis you're going to use. So there's no template. What I can advise you, and I'm going to talk more about this later. First of all, you can just watching a lot of debates helps, because you can see how top-level speakers have done these kinds of weighings in different situations, and you can steal their weighings from them. Secondly, in terms of philosophical weighings in particular, a very good webpage to start with is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So that's an internet page. They have explanations, discussions, and thought experiments on pretty much any concept that ever existed in philosophy, pretty much any principle or any moral metric. And they also have in-depth explanations of the importance of these concepts. So I think if you want a more academic approach to this, then just Google Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You can find a lot of material there. If you want a more debating approach, try to find the motions where you are most confused about it. So you've probably debated some motions in your life, and you know in which motions you face this as a problem. And try to find recorded debates on these motions or on similar motions. And there's a bunch of these from Euros, from Worlds, from HWS, from Macau, like there's a bunch of these. And look at how top speakers did this. And then you can use their weighing and build on it, add to it, remove from it. I think this is the best way to see how it's done in a variety of cases, because I cannot give you a simple template because it really depends on the particular value you're arguing for, the particular metric you're arguing for. Cool. Moving back to the persuasiveness of delivery. The second thing that makes a persuasive delivery is calling out biases. And recording has stopped.
Nicholas, I think internet has fallen, so we'll record it from now. Just a minute so I can see if we'll be back.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you are host now, so you can, I think, just restart the recording.
I will start recording now, and if he gets back, he.
Okay. Cool. So what do I mean by calling out biases? So judges, at least the vast majority of them, are not consciously biased. They're not like, oh my God, look, this ESL team, I want to fuck them over. Most biases are subconscious, which means that you want to preemptively bring biases to the alertness of the judges. It means you want to say things like, if you're debating against an EPL team and you're afraid that they sound more persuasive because of their accents and of their words, and preemptively say, I know that they sound more fancy, but please listen to our content because we actually have the content in this round. Or do not be deceived by their vocabulary. There's not much behind it. Here is why we think this is wrong. Just calling out people on the fact that they could be biased preemptively is something that makes them more alert to this. First of all, because people feel ashamed to be biased. They don't want to feel that they made a biased decision. And when you remind them that they could be biased, and that actually you think that you suspect that they could be biased, this creates a reaction of wariness in people, and they're going to look twice over their notes to see whether they screwed over the ESL team. And secondly, they know that when you bring this to the awareness of the panel, their panel is going to be more aware of this, and their panel can give bad feedback if they think that they were ESL biased or sexist biased or anything like this. So this is very important in terms of like just getting your impact to stick better. Third thing is just rhetorical tools. It's incredibly important to use your voice to stress things. So very often people have a problem that they speak very monotonously for 7 minutes, or they speak very fast and they don't change their pace for 7 minutes. It's not a problem to speak fast, and it's not a problem to speak slow, but there need to be changes of pace to emphasize things. So when you are, doing a strong emotional impact, you want to slow down, you want to use a deeper voice, you want to stress the most important words the way I'm doing now. If there is something that you want to show that something is very pervasive, like an example which happens very often, we've seen this happen here, we've seen this happen here, you want to accelerate, you want to name these examples one after the other, a barrage of examples to make it seem like it's very, very pervasive, to make it seem like it's very common. So you need to use your voice as a rhetorical tool to emphasize your impact. Because if things sound more impactful, then the attention of the people listening to you is also subconsciously going to be diverted to that. So of course, you can do the same impact on both sides, but if you make it sound impactful, this is the gateway to people paying more attention to what you're saying, and therefore crediting your impact more. And the last thing I want to say here is time management is incredibly important, which is to say, and this relates to an earlier question of when to stop mechanizing, start impacting, and all of these things. In order to ensure a largest chance of winning and that your most important impacts get out there, what you want to do in debating is you want your strongest arguments, your strongest rebuttal, your strongest mechanisms to come at the top. So the strongest argument, if you have 3 arguments in opening argument, the strongest one is the first one you will deliver, not the last one. Because people sometimes are like, I'm going to go from weaker to stronger. No, the strongest has to be the first. Why? Because time management is incredibly unpredictable. You never know what can happen, right? You can get a POI, which throws you off. You can, your screen can freeze, and then you're not sure if it's your internet or if it's the judge's internet. You can go into a digression and realize you don't have enough time, and then you're going to have to cut things. You're going to have to cut things on the spot to get to the end of your speech. You want to ensure that if you find yourself in a situation, you have to cut some mechanisms or cut some impacts, those you are cutting are going to be the least important ones, or at least the ones you can delegate to your partner. So you want to ensure, just in case you have problems with time management, that the things you deliver first are also the most important ones. So your strongest argument is delivered by 3:30. What happens later is also important, but less important, instead of starting your strongest argument at 5:50 because you mismanage your time. And I think this is just a general advice for how to stylistically make your impacts delivered better. The last thing I want to finish with is just how I think you can improve in terms of being able to craft better arguments or craft better impacts. The first thing is, and this also I think answers one of the first questions we had in terms of like other people being better than you and how you can match their skill and stuff like this. The first thing is actively watching debates. What do I mean by actively? So not just sitting down and watching a debate, but watching a debate and actually taking notes. And when the Prime Minister finishes, what do? You take a look over their case. You analyze if there are things you would want to add, there are things you would want to subtract. If you would like to add something, why would you be adding this? If you want to subtract something, you think they shouldn't have said something, why would they not have said that? If there are words like phrases or terms that they're using that you don't know of, or examples that they're referring to that you're not familiar with, Google these words, Google these examples, collect the knowledge on what they actually are and what they mean beyond the debate. Then think about and write down how you would rebut their speech. What are the weaknesses? What are the strong points? Then you listen to LO, and then you can compare. Okay, LO had this rebuttal, I had this rebuttal. How much of this coincides, and why is this true? Then do the same analysis for LO, what you would add, what you would subtract, how you would maybe tailor their arguments, or maybe switch them around a bit to make them better or stronger. Again, familiarize yourself with things that you're not familiar with, and take notes of all of this. Because what you're doing in doing so is, first of all, you're increasing your memory retention. Because when you actually work on a piece of content, when you analyze it, when you think about it, you remember it a lot more than when you just watch the debate passively. Secondly, this allows you to create your own arguments from other people's arguments. You can take a good argument as a baseline, as a foundation. You can remove things from it. You can add things to it. You can switch the phrasing to make it more tailored to your particular situation or to your particular case and your particular knowledge. And thirdly, you're going to get just more general knowledge from Googling things, from reading things. And insofar as you take notes of all of this, you're going to have these notes accessible for the future. And the same is true of watching workshops. So when you watch workshops, you want to keep very detailed notes of what people are saying in those workshops. So content workshops on, let's say, debating IR or debating econ. You also probably want to keep a case file of your own cases. So when you run a case, especially when you run a case very well, you want to keep those notes somewhere. And when you ask the judge for feedback about this case, you want to write the feedback below the case and keep it. All of this should be kept in one place. So you either you want to have a debating notebook or a couple of notebooks, or you want to have a single Word document or a single Google Docs. Why? Because printed materials are allowed in debating. If you have a single file or a single notebook where you keep notes from the debates you watched, notes from the workshops you watched, and notes from your own cases, you can use this during prep to draw material from this, to remind yourself of mechanisms, to remind yourself of the impacts. And if this is all in one place, you're largely going to know where it's located. So even if you don't get the benefit of organically learning more arguments, of organically having a larger repository of arguments, because you will learn more things, remember more things from working on this actively, you will at least have a database of things that you can draw from during prep time, which is very useful. Second thing I think is very helpful is judging. Because judging puts you in a different perspective. It puts you in the perspective of having to evaluate other people's impacts and evaluate them comparatively. So in order to give a team the first and another team the second, you need to evaluate why one team's impacts were more important and one team's arguments in general. But if this session is about impacts, then we're talking about impacts. Why one team's impacts are more important than another team's impacts. So it forces you to come up with a metric. And the deliberation with other judges is in essence a debate on metrics. Because unless you have the same initial call, judges will disagree on what the intended or the most important metric is. And you will have to explain why you disagree with the other judge and why you put a team above another team. And this is an exercise in weighing and an exercise in metrics, i.e. it forces you to prove the importance of impact and not just the impact itself. But secondly, it just gives you knowledge on how judge deliberations look. You actually get an insight of when judges have 15 minutes, what do they spend the most time on? Where do they save time? What do they cut out of the discussion? You get an insight of what burdens of proof judges expect from teams. And then with this knowledge, you can tailor your arguments to this because you will know better what your judge expects. So judging tournaments is a good way to get a different perspective into how to increase the efficiency of your impacts. I mean, your arguments overall, but insofar as the session is about impacts, that as well goes without saying. The third thing is you want to regularly do prep time, either alone or with your partner. So every now and then, like twice a week, take a motion on your own or with your partner, try to come up with a case like Prime Minister's speech in 15 minutes. And then you can do a couple of things with this. You can record this speech and you can listen to it later and you can try to find your own mistakes. You can try to send it to a coach or judge you trust to give you feedback on this. You can do exercises with this. Like for example, if you can give a 7-minute speech and then you listen to it and you try to shorten it to 6 minutes, like do the same content in 6 minutes to try to see maybe where you are wasting time, what are, things that are superfluous in your speech and stuff like this. But also it's very useful to do this exercise for debates, motions that have recorded debates. So if you can find a motion that has a high quality recorded debate and you do prep time and you come up with a case, and you deliver a speech, and you listen to your speech, and then you listen to an actual strong, top quality Prime Minister speech, you can compare these things. And then you can actually have a better insight of where you are lacking, because you're going to have a reference point. So doing regular prep by yourself with your partner and recording those speeches can be very useful in a number of ways, a number of exercises. And lastly, this is just a mechanistic exercise I've heard used by good speakers. And this is the 3 mechanisms exercise. Which is to say, if you want to practice proving impacts, mechanizing them, especially in, a spar debate that do not have a large stake or do not have a stake at all because it's not a tournament, force yourself to come up with 3 mechanisms for every argument, even if they're dumb. So even if you have 2 good mechanisms, come up with a 3rd, even if it's valid. Force yourself to come up with some generic 3rd mechanism. Because the first thing that this does, it forces you to diversify. It forces you to think out of the box, to search the depths of your brain for something else, some other mechanism which we could run. And then if it succeeds, you have a larger repository of mechanisms for the future, but also it allows you to ask for feedback in a more targeted way from judges. Because you can tell judges, okay, we had these 3 mechanisms. Can you give us specific feedback on each of them? How could we improve them? Or if we cannot improve them, should we cut them altogether? The 3 mechanisms exercise means that in every situation, you're going to have different individual mechanisms for which you can ask targeted feedback from judges and therefore improve your arguments into the future. And I think this kind of approaching judges is always very important because people very often just ask for general feedback. And this is good, but this is the least useful thing, because if you ask for general feedback, what most judges will give you is just a rephrasing of the OA, and this is not useful. You want to ask them for specific things you want improvement. So in this case, if you want improvement on impacting, how could we improve on our impacting? Ask them, how could we better weigh our impacts, or how could we better mechanize our impacts? So specific feedback questions to judges improve the quality of feedback you're going to get, and therefore improve your capacity to be able to run better impacts and better mechanization into the future. So this is just a couple of pieces of advice as to how you can be able to improve. And this pretty much hits the hour-and-a-half mark, and this is also where I am done. So if there are any questions, people can ask them now. If not, I thank you for inviting me, and I hope this has been useful to everyone. I'm gonna give it like 30 seconds.